All right, it is Friday, May the 2nd, 2025. Welcome to Borderlines. We are joined today by Dan Hiebert. Did I pronounce that right?
Yes, you did.
Perfect. Who is a professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia. This episode was actually recommended by one of our previous guests, Lisa Brunner, who's a international student advisor and a member of the Migration Institute at UBC, who emailed me to say that Dan had produced this paper that we absolutely needed to talk about. And she was right. Like, having read the papers, I think this is going to be a great episode on basically demographics and Canadian immigration. I want to start first with what will probably be a stupid question of what could be many this episode. And that is, what does it mean? Like, emeritus is retired, but not.
No, it is retired, and the emeritus title is given to people who are in quotes good standing, which is like 98% of people, and maybe even 100%. And it means nice things like you get to keep your library privileges, and you get to keep your email, and you get to retain a relationship with the university, even though you're no longer getting a paycheck.
Mm.
Hmm.
And so the episode, as I mentioned, is on demographics and immigration. I find this topic super interesting because one of the rationales for immigration in Canada is that Canada is getting older and we need more immigrants. And I've not really been aware of anything that kind of goes beyond that. Like, is immigration actually making Canada younger? Are there other ways to address the aging population? And your paper really dives into just how complex this topic is. What's your overall, like, general just conclusion, maybe, before we get into specific questions?
Well, sure, and feel free to edit this if I talk too long. I'll just give you 3 points, and you can decide which ones you want to use. The first is, I think Canadians haven't appreciated just how fundamental immigration has become for Canada's future. Basically, Canadians no longer have enough children to grow the population. It would remain stable for a while and then start falling. If we could do this imaginary exercise of just stopping immigration, Canada's population would start to decline in 2029. So like it's just a long time. And it would that process of decline would get more and more momentum over time. So what that means is, if you want to know anything about Canada's future population, it's always an immigration question. How many kindergarten spaces will Canada need in 5 years' time? That's an immigration question. How many primary school, secondary school, university places will Canada need over time? It's an immigration question. How big will Canada's workforce be? It's an immigration question. Canadians have basically yielded to government the whole dynamic on how big and what Canada's population is going to look like just because of low fertility. So that's the first point. The second point is kind of in the title of the paper, and it's about the title of the paper speaks about balancing population growth and aging. So basically, the more immigration you have, the slower the aging process in the Canadian population. But at the same time, the more immigration you have, the faster the population grows. So immigration policy is a big trade-off, in a sense, from a demographic point of view. It's a big trade-off between how many more people do you want to have versus how old do you want your society to be. And you can't have it both ways. You can't have both, like not aging Canadian society that stays the same size, and you can't have a Canadian society that, well, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. It just doesn't work to have both of those things managed at the same time. You have to make a trade-off or a balance between them.
And why is an aging population a bad thing? Or is it a bad
Yeah, that's, it's a good question. And I've spoken to lots of environmentalists and others too, who say, maybe it's a good thing for Canada to have a smaller population. And I think should be part of a national conversation. But if we have a smaller population, it's going to be an older population. So now I get to the heart of your question. What's wrong with an aging population? The trick with an aging population is you end up, unless you change retirement age, we could talk about that later if
Which
you
is
want.
political toxicity.
Absolutely. I mean, Canadians are just not fond of that question whatsoever. But unless you change the retirement age, as a population has an average older age, it means you have more people retired and fewer people working. And I'm sure you and all of your listeners know that there's a very strong relationship between age and the cost of social services, particularly healthcare, pensions, old age security, et cetera, et cetera. So on average, an older society means you have less tax revenue coming in and you have more expenditures going out. Again, you feel free to edit this out, but I just find this such a fascinating example. I'm going to give it to you, and you can keep it in if you want to. The oldest society on earth is Japan. In Japan, we have 48 people over the age of 65 for every 100 people that are in the working age of the Japanese population. It's an extraordinarily high rate of what we call the old age dependency ratio, almost like 1 to 2, okay, 2 workers for every one person who's retired. Japan has approximately the same tax rate as Canada and approximately the same kind of package of public services of Canada, but there's one big difference. Japan has over 260% of national debt to its GDP, right? So its debt rate is like 6 times what Canada is. That's what it looks like when you have a really old population. You try to maintain social services and you don't increase taxes.
Yeah, and from what I understand, the way the Japanese lend money to their government is different as well.
Yeah.
So I want to go into actually the paper itself, and maybe you could just walk us through some charts.
Sure.
So let me see if I bring open, we have, because what your paper does in exceptional detail is kind of discusses various scenarios of immigration, as you said, its impact on population, and possibly what the average age of Canada will be. So I think
Yep.
it'd be easiest to just go through each of the tables and charts in your paper. So this is the first one, the assumptions for Canada's
Mhm.
population projections. Fertility rate, 1.33. I think replacement is 2.1.
Yes, exactly.
We have the women living longer than men by 4 years, 1.5 per 1,000 people leaving Canada. And so what are these various scenarios of population growth?
Yep. Before I answer that, a real quick footnote for you. Sorry, I'm an academic. I'm going to give you a footnote.
Yeah, no problem.
Since the population projection was done, Canada's fertility rate has actually even declined further. Now it's 1.26. So this paper is like an optimistic view, slightly, but an optimistic view of Canada's future rather than an accurate one because we now have even lower fertility. Okay, end of footnote. Now to your question. So what demographers do is they don't talk about a level of immigration, they talk about a rate of immigration. So Canada's population, let's just make it simple, let's call it 40 million, even though it's a little bit more than 40 million, but it makes it super simple. If the rate of immigration was 1% of that, it would be 400,000 per year. And over time, right, the population might grow and it would have to become larger than 400,000, but that would be the level of immigration that we would have now. What I asked for in this commissioned population projection is for Statistics Canada to use a bunch of different rates across a spectrum from really very low immigration to much higher immigration than we've seen in Canada in the last while, with the sort of current rate of immigration right in the middle. So maybe I could just spend another second on that. I find this very interesting. In the last decade, we've had kind of 3 different rates of immigration for Canada. When the Trudeau government came into power in 2015, Canada's immigration level was around about 250,000 per year. That equates to a population rate of 0.6%. Sorry, it's an annoying abstract number, but the 250,000 a year translates to a rate of about 0.6% of the population per year coming in as immigrants. Then what the Trudeau government did was it doubled that rate between 2015 and 2024, we went from about 250,000 to about 500,000. So it went from a rate of 0.6% to a rate of about 1.2%. Then subsequently, there was a whole bunch, I know you've explored this in your podcast, a whole bunch of changes in popular opinion about immigration and so forth. And they've reduced the rate for 2025 down to a little less than 1% of the population. We're at about 0.9%. And each of those three scenarios are built into the model, right? So there's a scenario for 0.6, a scenario for 0.9, and a scenario for 1.2. So we can look at the long-term implications of each of those different rates of immigration if they were held constant for 50 years. Now, of course, that's not going to happen, but it's just a useful kind of thinking exercise. If what we're doing now would cascade into the future, what would Canada's population look like?
Well, I think you talk about, maybe it's in one of the upcoming charts, that there's scenarios that range from a Canada that has a population of 12.3 million in 2100 to, if the 2023 rate continued indefinitely,
Yeah, huge.
452 million by
Yeah,
2100.
exactly. Yeah, and that's what I meant about policy making the whole difference, right? The stats that you just gave us are not in this particular chart, but I did a little exercise where I said, if there was no net immigration to Canada and we kept seeing declining fertility, what would Canada's population look like in the year 2100? And like you said, 12 million, like it drops by 3/4, basically, almost. If, on the other hand, we had that extraordinary rate of immigration and temporary migration that we saw in 2022 and 2023, especially 2023, which was a 3.2% population growth rate in 1 year. If you projected that forward all the way to the year 2100, Canada would have an enormous population of 450 million people. Now, that will never happen. There's no way there'd be that many immigrants coming to Canada. But I'm just saying, those are the sort of bookends, the imaginary bookends of what Canada's population could look like. We're not going to be at either of those bookends, but the point it makes, I think, pretty effectively, is that immigration policy sets the parameters of what Canada's population is going to look like. Whatever they choose in IRCC and in the Government of Canada, that's what population is going to look like.
And so this chart then shows those
more realistic levels.
Yeah. So you've got basically anything ranging from the current population to
or
around
a little
100
bit less,
million.
actually. Yeah.
Well, I think right now, like the current levels plan, the goal is to shrink Canada's population. So if you took the current levels plan and just nothing changes, which isn't what Mark Carney has promised, but in theory,
Yeah.
you would see Canada's population be smaller by 2071.
Don't mean to be disagreeable, but basically, the reason why Canada's population is projected to shrink over the next couple of years is because of the expectation that there will be more temporary residents leaving than arriving by a large number. Like, if I remember correctly, I think the expectation is there will be a net reduction in Canada's temporary resident population of over 400. I think it's 440,000 per year in 2025 and 2026. We can talk, if you want to, about whether that's actually going to happen, because I have doubts about that, but that's what's being projected. If you just look at the permanent immigration rate that's going on from 2025 to 2027, it would yield a little bit of population growth. It's the temporary side that's making this short-term population decline. I hope that made sense.
Yeah. Now, here's where I started to get confused. Can you explain old age dependency ratio?
Yeah. So it's basically like there's actually two different dependency ratios. There's a youth dependency ratio and an old age dependency ratio. I didn't bother to analyze the youth dependency ratio. I really wanted to focus on the aging phenomenon in this paper. So the old age dependency ratio is the ratio, it's like I said about Japan a few minutes ago, it's the ratio of people who are expected to be retired versus expected to be in the labor force. So it's literally the ratio of people over the age of 65 compared with the number of people who are between 18 and the end of 64, the day before they turn 65. When I had this study commissioned, at that time, Canada's old age dependency ratio was just under 30%. It was 29.5. 29.5 seniors for every 100 people in the workforce. Is that making sense?
Yeah.
And as I said before, oldest society on earth is Japan, and it's 48 seniors for every 100 people working.
And looking at this chart, and for those who are just listening to the audio, we're going to link to the paper in the show notes. The difference between a very low immigration level and a very high immigration level is a difference of 30% in the percentage of the population who is over the age of 65 by 2071. Did I get that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's about right. Yep.
And what
Yep.
does that difference mean in terms of actual like social services and things like that?
Well, at the low end, I'm just going to have to take off my glasses for a second to remember the number. Even even if we have a really robust immigration rate, so the highest rate I used in the paper was 1.8%, which would equate to about 750,000 immigrants per year. We've never been there, but if we were to instantly go there, and if we would maintain that rate of immigration all the way for 50 years, we would still have a higher old age dependency ratio than we have today. So that's kind of sobering, right? Even imagining a really high immigration scenario, we're still going to become an older society. That's kind of a given, given Canada's low fertility. However, if we have lower rates of immigration, that increase in the old age dependency ratio happens significantly more. And if we would have kept the immigration rate that was back in 2015 of about 250,000 per year, which equates to about 0.6% of the population per year, that old age dependency rate would get really high, way higher than any society on earth today, way higher than Japan's rate of old age dependency. So that's one side of the trade-off, right? The higher the immigration, the lower the old age dependency ratio.
And one of the things that we were talking about before we came on that maybe you could walk me through again here is, so in your paper, you talk about how with all the immigration from 1951 to 2001, the average age in Canada was only reduced by 0.8 years. Yet in this chart going forward, it seems like immigration has a lot bigger impact on how old Canada is. Why is that?
The simple answer to that is fertility. Back in the second half of the 20th century, especially in the early part of that, in the 1950s and 1960s, Canada's fertility rate was 3.5 or higher. So the average woman in Canada had 3.5 children. That's my era. That's when I was born. And my memory as a child is kids everywhere, on my block, there were just tons of kids. That was just like the norm of Canadian society. So when you have that higher rate of natural increase, then immigration doesn't impact the age structure of a population very much because you have a robust level of births happening in your society. By the end of the 20th century, so in the latter years of the 20th century, and certainly now in the 21st century, we have ultra low fertility. Canada's fertility is one of the lowest in the whole world. I think we rank 188th or something like that among countries in terms of our rate of fertility. So once you have an ultra low fertility, then immigration will matter more in terms of the future age structure of the population. Even so, though, the difference in average age of immigrants coming into Canada and the average age of Canadians is only 10 years. We tend to get immigrants who are, let's say 30-ish is kind of our average age of an immigrant. Mm-hmm. The average age of a Canadian is 40, 41, something like that, right? So there's not that huge a gap between the average age of immigrants and the average age of Canadians. So there's an impact on the age structure, but it's not huge.
Do we know the
So,
average age of like economic immigrants, family class, refugees?
I could look it up. I don't have it off the top of my head. It's somewhere
Or do
on
you
my
have a sense of
computer.
which one might be even higher, lower?
Well, family is probably a little higher because, as you know, there is a parental and grandparental sponsorship. And also remember that when you land as an immigrant, you're entitled to bring your children up to the age of 22, I think it is these
Yep.
days. And you're the lawyers, you'll
Yeah,
remember
yeah,
the exact
22.
numbers. So that tends to keep the incoming population a little bit younger than the family reunification folks that come afterwards, because you don't bring your young kids in family reunification. Typically, you bring older people. So yeah, there's probably a bit of a difference across categories, but I don't think that difference is huge. Can I just say one other thing? I'll answer a
Go for it.
question you didn't ask. Why are immigrants so old? Why aren't immigrants like, I don't know, 20 or something like that? There's another trade-off here. We have, as you well know, because you're working in this field, we have a high expectations of people. We demand people to have a lot of education, experience, and so forth. So the higher you set the criteria for the comprehensive ranking system, typically the older it takes a person to get before they can meet those criteria. So in trying to select for people who've performed very well in their lives, we end up requiring people to be a bit older. So we do have this average age. It's not so far from the average age of Canadians.
Although this is the irony of the comprehensive ranking system, is that it gives so many points for youth. Uh,
Yes.
and so it's kind of the paradox a lot of people find them in, is that as they gain credentials, they lose points for age. And so
Yeah.
it leaves people kind of between a rock and a hard place in some senses. I
Yeah.
mean, this sort of transitions to the part that really intrigues me, and that I was most interested in the paper, which was about the things that you had to say about short and long-term immigration policy, and how to develop policy that looks to more long-term immigration outcomes and demographics. Like how we've talked a fair bit about age and how to try and address the aging population, but in terms of other things such as like human capital factors and labor shortages, what kind of findings can you walk us through some of the findings that you reached on those factors as well, and how this data can actually help inform short and long-term immigration strategy?
Yeah. So one of the things I spoke about in the paper it has to do with the way Canada sets its selection policy. And there's a trade-off between meeting immediate labor market shortages versus selecting people that have the kinds of skill set and experience set that sets them up for future success, but not necessarily instant success. And we can really see this. There's been a ton of research on this. There's been like an industry on economists that have been looking at the economic outcomes of immigrants coming to Canada. I have like tons of respect for that work. We have really excellent economists in Canada that have figured this stuff out. And basically, if you select people to fill particular occupational gaps, they tend to get jobs immediately, but they tend to not have the best long-term outcomes because they've got the skill set to do one thing, and that's great. That's exactly what we need. But maybe in 5, 10 years, we don't need so many of those people.
Mm-hmm.
So they're a little less flexible. Whereas if we select folks based on, the human capital is the word that economists use. I'll just use that terminology. If we really select for that, people are highly flexible. They don't necessarily get the job that they want right at the outset. In fact, it's very common. I'm sure you know this. We have a huge credentialization issue in Canada. People tend to start with work that's well below their skill set, but it really improves over time, and quite quickly, actually. Like it takes just a couple of 3 years before people get on a road to, really quite significant success. And the long-term outcomes of those folks are better. So you have to balance, right? So one of the trade-offs in immigration is we've got a whole bunch of shortages. We don't have enough people in, say, elderly care homes, or we don't have enough people who are driving trucks, or whatever the case may be, right? So you have to balance those needs with the kind of higher expectations of future prosperity when you choose people who are going to be like at the cutting edge of things in terms of what they know and what they can do.
And then one of the other things you talk about in terms of that long term is, I don't know if Ponzi schemes are right, but it's almost like you write adding 4 to 5 million to Canada's population over the next decade cannot simply be undone at the end of that period. The same aging pressures will remain, but with a large population that may require even higher immigration levels. As long as fertility remains below replacement, this issue will persist, regardless of Canada's population size. So there's almost, I don't know if Ponzi scheme again is the right word, but there's this need that like when you're bringing in more people, you're kind of just creating a situation where you always need to then be bringing in more people.
Yeah, if your solution to population aging, if your chosen solution to population aging is immigration, and fertility stays low, you have to just keep ramping up immigration over time. Like a fixed rate of immigration is never going to solve the problem. You have to keep ramping it up. So then we've got a whole bunch of other choices we should be thinking about. For example, what's the level of taxation? For example, what's the level of services that Canadians are going to be able to expect? For example, when do you retire? I don't know if you're going to get to it, but in part of the paper, I imagine something that is incredibly unpopular, which is what happens if we had an average retirement age of 70 instead of 65. The aging problem almost goes away. I mean, you still have to have some immigration, but the aging problem almost goes away if people work longer, right?
And didn't Harper do that? Harper tried raising it to 67, I believe, and Trudeau
and that was super unpopular. Yeah. There was a survey done, I think it was in 2023, if memory serves, it was Abacus, and they gave people 15 policy choices, and they asked them like, how would you appreciate this particular policy choices? And they were all really tough stuff. And of the 15 policy choices they gave people, the very bottom one was to resolve the addiction issue in Canada through making all hard drugs legal and just completely letting everything go on that particular one. That was the least popular policy suggestion that was in that set of 15. The second least popular one was raising retirement age. And all the other 13 things that were all tough policy choices were more popular than those two. So Canadians are just not wanting to go there.
Yeah, so what are there studies that say sort of like what would need to be done to reduce or turn around the decrease in the fertility rate? During the last election, Pierre Poilievre linked it to housing prices kind of clumsily by saying that by the time a woman could afford a home, their biological clock was done. But behind that choice of terminology seemed to be that housing is a cause.
So where can I go with that? So many things I want to say. Let me start with saying countries that make it easier and have less penalties for women to have children tend to have a little bit higher fertility rates than countries where it's really tough to have kids, right? So I'll just pick a couple of countries off the top of my head. South Korea has the world's lowest fertility rate, and it doesn't have great programs for women to stay in the labor force, to have daycare, all that kind of stuff, right? Whereas at the opposite end of the scale, the Nordic countries. They don't have replacement fertility, but they have a little bit higher fertility than Canada has, more like about 1.7, 1.8, rather than Canada down at 1.26. And that, they have a robust set of programs that make it easier for women to have children and to raise children, right? So you can move in that direction. You can have a more open. Oh, by the way, some other countries have tried financial bonuses. In fact, part of Canada tried that, right? Quebec used to have a financial bonus for a third child. Found out that it didn't work, so they withdrew it as a policy. So you can do it through having more generous and more appropriate social programs for folks who are bearing children. You can do it through bonuses and so forth. But here's the kicker. There was a recent report out, and it looked at 60 different countries that tried, that's called pronatal programs. That's the generic term for this, try to get people to have higher levels of fertility. Not a single one of them was successful enough that they got to replacement fertility. First problem. Second problem is the impacts of those programs tended to be of short duration rather than long term. So at first, it has a bit of an impact, and that impact withers away over time. By the way, the country that probably tries the hardest on this is Hungary. Hungary, as you know, has a government that's very adverse to immigration and changing the cultural nature of Hungarian society. So they've really pushed hard on raising fertility. And again, it worked a little bit and not enough at first, and now it's just not working at all, or at least not working very much at all. So Hungary's fertility rate is, again, way below replacement, despite massive investments in that particular area. So I don't know, it's really hard. Like, why would people choose to have a child because somebody tells them it'd be better for society for you to have more children? Like, that's just not it's not a rhetoric that tends to work on people very much. It's such an intimate decision that's taken over, with so many factors into consideration, and being good for your country just doesn't really play into that calculation, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, that wasn't a factor in my decision to have kids at all. What the good of Canada would be.
Yeah.
The other thing you talked about in your paper was how there's also this compounding problem where, to the extent that housing prices are the cause of low fertility,
Yeah.
that increased immigration, if it exceeds housing supply, further compounds the problem.
Yep. Yeah. It cascading issue that's a worry, obviously. So if you're going to have a high rate of immigration, for goodness sake, make sure that you've got infrastructure to match it. Otherwise, you're just compounding the issue. Yeah.
So this all seems very pessimistic, right? Like, the population's going to get older no matter what we do. Canadians don't want to work longer. Housing, we'll see. I mean, the new government has said they're going to build however many homes, but we'll see if it happens. So there isn't really a reason to think fertility rates will increase. And we can blow up the population, but it's only going to marginally help. Is there a reason to be optimistic? That's the sense that I got from your paper was, I thought, oh boy, like, no matter what we do, we're in trouble. Is that the takeaway?
So I'm very much a glass half full person in most of my life. Like, I'm generally speaking much more optimistic than most people around me. But when I did this serious dive into demographics, some of my optimism sort of wore away. Yeah, it's tough. Like, Canadians face some very tough choices, and the reason why I wanted this paper to be public, like, I really want, like, there to be a national conversation about this, because I just don't think Canadians are facing reality of what the future is going to look like. We need some really substantial adjustments as early as possible to enable us to deal with that future. And that has to do with things like productivity. I mean, Canada has, I think until this year, maybe it's changed just a little bit now, but over the last 30 years, Canada's had the slowest productivity growth of any OECD country. Now, couple that with the need to supply healthcare for more older people with less tax revenues coming in. Unless we can turn around that productivity deficit, we're in deep trouble. So that's point number one. Point number two, there's not enough, in my opinion anyway, not enough encouragement to make sure that everyone who's capable of working is in the labor force. There's a lot of groups that are just having trouble getting in the labor force, and we need to do better on that. I know it's unpopular, but I do think the Canadian retirement age has to rise. We have to and we have to figure out how we're going to do immigration the most productively to make sure that it actually benefits us in this whole situation rather than makes things more difficult. So all of that stuff has to be aligned together with expansion in the healthcare system, expansion in the housing supply, and so forth. So we just need to have a national conversation about how we're going to do this and approach it really intelligently.
Yeah. Can you explain
And by the way, I'll just say
raising
one more thing. And what Canadians don't need is someone like me, a so-called expert, telling them what level of immigration we should have. What Canadians need is a conversation about what kind of future do we want. And once we figure out what that looks like, then we can determine what size of immigration we need in order to make that future happen.
What does it actually mean to raise the retirement age? Is that just when someone's eligible for Canada
Yeah.
Land and old age security?
Best example is Denmark. Denmark is moving. I forgot when it's going to finish. It's an ongoing scale. I think it's within about 5 years. You will need to be 69 before you can access whatever old age benefits that they have in Denmark, which tend to be.
And in Canada, it's 65.
Actually, you can get access to CPP now at 60.
60.
Yeah, but you pay a hefty penalty, or you get a hefty penalty in the amount that you'll be paid. And a third of Canadians actually access their CPP the day they turn 60. So that enables quite early retirement. And I get it. I'm in a very privileged position. For me, work means sitting at a keyboard. I don't have to lift stuff and stand all day and all that kind of thing. So for me, I could work past 65. It wasn't like a big deal. And I get it that, it's somewhat problematic for a person with a job that's not physically demanding to suggest that people who are, I don't know, plumbers and carpenters and retail clerks and so forth work until they're older. But it's kind of what we need if we're going to make everything work in the future.
It's interesting to hear you say all this because, it certainly goes against the rhetoric that we're hearing that immigration levels are hurting Canada and hurting our long-term outcomes. In your conclusion, you talk about the fact that we need to integrate immigration policies that boost workforce participation and promote productivity. Do you have specific ideas as to how that might be accomplished? I know that's sort of moving into the area of specific immigration policy, but I wonder if you have any ideas about how that might be accomplished.
Okay, so there's stuff I can talk about and stuff that I'm not good to speak about. Simply, I just don't have the expertise. I'm not an economist that deals with issues like productivity. I know there are folks out there who have some good ideas. I'm not one of them. What I can talk about is the economic selection side.
Sure.
I'm a big fan of Mikhail Skoudaroud's work, and I know you've had him more than once
times.
Actually. And well, it's not just Mikhail. There's other really excellent economists in Canada as well. And but I use Mikhail as my example because he and I have such a similar idea about things, which is make economic selection the best it can possibly be so that there's room in the immigration system to also enable humanitarian stuff to happen, right? So we got to be just like laser focused on the best possible economic outcomes of the people we select on the economic side to give us a bit of room to make sure we can be generous in the rest of our immigration program. And I think you've already interviewed folks like Mikhail and Chris Warswick and so forth that have talked about how to do that. So I think there's better experts than me at talking about that stuff.
Yeah. One of the other developments that's been interesting, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it, is like for the entirety of me growing up, GDP per capita was considered like the gold standard of how to measure a country's economic performance. And now that Canada's is sliding, there's almost what feels like this Orwellian, well, GDP per capita is not actually that important. And it, to what extent, like, do you have a take on that? Because part of what concerns me is like, okay, well, if we're no longer, just because ours is going down and the propaganda machine has to always be positive, that if we're now focusing on, there's not even really a new metric that's been proposed, but if we turn away from that because it makes us feel uncomfortable, are we going to design policies that don't focus on GDP per capita?
Yeah. This is something, again, I tell you, I'm an optimist, but this is something that does not make me optimistic. What I've done, many people have done this, but I went to the data and I made a chart of annual change in GDP per capita over time. And if you go back to the early post-war period in the 50s and 60s, Canada's GDP per capita was growing over 3% per year. And if you extend that line to the present, just now that the trend line on that has actually hit zero. So it's just like an unbroken trend that is just a declining line from an average of over 3% per year to an average of nothing. So what does that mean? It means that at this point, unless something changes, Canada's prosperity is not increasing. And so that's another thing, again, that needs to be part of a national conversation. Canadians, I'm older than both of you. I've grown up under the assumption that things get better over time. That the things that Canadians have and are able to achieve now is less than it's going to be in the future. But now the GDP per capita has hit, growth per year has hit zero. That's no longer the case. A person who grows up in Canada now is not going to be better off than their parents' generation. That's never happened before. We're in uncharted territory, and I think you're quite right that since we don't want to face the consequences of that, we just imagine it doesn't matter. But it does. I mean, we're not looking at a society of growing prosperity anymore.
I mean, in a similar vein, I feel like this idea that we need to really attract the best and the brightest, this human capital thing, this is not a new idea.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that we have theoretically been doing for many years now. And so, like data modeling perhaps has become better and, data analytics has become more sophisticated, but when we talk sometimes about what our long-term economic outcomes are, I feel like I've lost the plot on it's not that this is a new enterprise, yeah. The idea of trying to do predictive analytics on what's going to happen, and yet we are still in this decline. And so, I kind of wonder whether or not we're measuring the right things. Are we looking specifically, and you talked about this in your paper as well, like short-term labor gaps, are we filling those things? But of course, those things can shift very rapidly. We can see this by programs that are attracting IT workers, and now we have shortages. We don't have those shortages anymore. And, that industry has become oversaturated, perhaps only temporarily, we never know. But, looking more at truly long-term impacts, what is the retention rate, what happens with the next generation, all of those sorts of things. And we talked about those more theoretically, but I just wonder whether or not that kind of study is being done to kind of move the mark on who actually, what factors are being measured, or are we still sticking to the same age, language skills, level of education,
Well, yeah. So as you know, we have a comprehensive ranking system, and it does exactly those things you just mentioned in the last 5 seconds of when you were speaking. It's based exactly on age, education level, experience, et cetera, et cetera. Those tend to be the best predictors we've got. They're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. They're not perfect, but they tend to be the best we've got. Then beside that, we've got something called category-based selection, which adjusts the system to bring in people that are in high demand. So that might be folks in the healthcare professions.
Francophones. Here you go, Steve.
Well, I'm going to get to that. Yeah. I've now learned to use the new vocabulary, early childhood educators. I used to use different words for that, but I've learned to use the proper thing. Like, so we're making adjustments in that direction. And then as you said, Deanna, the Francophone side. The Francophone side is a really interesting one. Now, let me take a second to get around to that. So when you ask the question of like, what ratio of immigrants are actually economically selected? Okay, so off the top, a quarter of Canada's immigration is family reunification. So they're not being selected by anything other than family ties.
Right.
Another 15% are refugees, give or take, humanitarian, and they're not being selected for their economic potential to contribute to Canada. So now we're left with 60% who are under economic selection. And of that now, we're moving towards 12% that are going to be selected for being Francophone minorities outside Quebec. And we don't have fantastic studies on the economic outcomes of Francophone immigrants outside Quebec, but what the hints that we have from the studies we have is it's not like a super great set of economic outcomes. Like if you're coming as a Francophone into an Anglophone society because, you know, there's this overall social objective that there should be more bilingualism across Canada, that doesn't mean you're going to get a great job. You got a tough row to hoe if that's how you've been selected for Canada. And what you tend to see is quite a bit of internal mobility, secondary migration of folks who come to Canada. So folks might get selected for, I don't know, Saskatchewan and then end up in Montreal. Yeah. Because that's a place where the bilingual skill set or the Francophone skill set is going to be more acknowledged. Anyway, the point I'm getting to is if you've got 25% family reunification, you've got 15% humanitarian, you've got 12% Francophone, you've actually less than half now. You're down to 48%. And remember that includes both the principal applicant and accompanying family members. So the ratio of how many are actually selected for this best and brightest stuff with our comprehensive ranking system is a small fraction of the immigrants coming to Canada.
Yeah, we have a comment from someone named Andy on YouTube who talks about how important it is to bring human capital and financial capital to specific regions in Canada, which touches also on something in your paper regarding where immigrants wind up. And so since immigrants seem to predominantly be going to cities, do we also have this future in Canada, which probably is already the case, that rural areas, based on those previous charts, get older and smaller, and Canada just increasingly becomes these urban conclaves?
Well, I'm going to do something which I rarely do, which is self-promotion. I've got another paper coming out with the CD Howe Institute later this month that looks exactly at this question. So I'm happy to speak to it, but I don't know, it sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but if you want to invite me again, I'm happy to talk at length about the regional dimensions of this, because it's another full-length study that looks at exactly that. I'll just give you one hint at the tone of that paper. Basically, it's immigration that has set up the difference between the faster and the slower growing parts of Canada. So it's very difficult to resolve those issues through immigration. The natural tendency for immigrants, they're uprooting themselves. Why would they go to a place with less economic opportunity, with fewer people they know? They're moving thousands of kilometers. They're going to go to a place that's going to be best for them. And I make no criticism. That just seems to me to be kind of a given in the immigration process. So what we're trying to do through regionalization programs in Canada is to change that natural dynamic and to say to immigrants, well, you might like to go to the place you think is best for you, but we're actually going to suggest that you go somewhere else, and hopefully you'll stay there because we need that. You don't necessarily benefit from that, but we need that. That's a tough kind of tough issue to resolve.
Yeah.
Yeah, Andy just made the further comment that immigration programs have to be aligned with infrastructure plans and housing construction. And I think that has really hit home based on how
Yep.
rollout or lack of rollout with the temporary foreign worker program and student programs.
Yep.
Kind of.
Yeah.
That's what we saw.
Crash and burn this year. Yeah.
Exactly.
There was a total mismatch.
Yeah.
And it not just took down the outcomes of those students and workers, but also public opinion about immigration in general.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about the idea that this needs to be a national conversation. For me, what is critical to that is that some of this information, this demographic information, needs to be shared more widely. I have absolutely no idea. I have an instinctive sense based on the clients that I work with about outcomes, even for refugee claimants, in terms of how they're doing and what they're contributing. But I think that information should be much more widely publicly available, because I think that a lot of the assumptions that are being made are not data driven. They're not scientific. And so people get stuck on this rhetoric about, the number of people that are fraudulent, but what about the genuine claimants that are actually landed and their family members? How did they do, and how did their family members do in the next generation? Like, I think that is all part to having an informed conversation, as opposed to just.
And in some other work I've done a little bit of what you're asking for. And one of the things which I found really notable in Canada is that the second generation of refugees is actually doing pretty well. Not every single person, like, let's not overgeneralize.
No.
Well, okay, let me be honest. I'm a child of a refugee, so there you go. And so's Mikkel, by the way.
Yeah.
I shouldn't speak for him. The second generation tends to do pretty well in terms of educational outcomes, in terms of labor force participation, in terms of incomes and so forth. So that's really important research to have done. Good news is
with family class too. Like, I mean, I would be really, we tend to draw this hard line between humanitarian, family reunification, and economic that I think it's not based on science or economics even. And I think that a lot of that is lost.
Long-term outcomes of first and second generation immigrants are actually better than the Canadian average, which is interesting, right? Like, think about what that means, but nevertheless, I think that's a useful point to make. Also, I'll quickly say that the fantastic thing, the tremendous news in Canada is we've got the best data of anybody on this stuff. And we've also got really good economists and demographers in Canada that are working on these issues very effectively. It's the missing link in all of this is getting that information into public understanding and discourse. Canadians are, I'm afraid to say it, but Canadians are kind of woefully misinformed about immigration issues and demographic issues, which is why I wrote these papers in the first place, to try to be informative. But you started this on a very sobering note, where you seem to me to be both like really capable people, and you said you didn't understand some aspects of the paper. So that worries me, I have to say.
Yeah.
That worries me.
I want to be mindful of the time, and this kind of does dive into maybe your other paper, but I'm just curious, like, do you know the historian or the podcaster Dan Carlin? Probably the biggest history podcast, the biggest history podcast out there by far. He had
showing my ignorance.
It's like, you have to be into the podcast world. Strongly recommended as well if you're into history. But he had an episode that was tangential in one of his episodes about how he believed that the future of North America, and I think he said especially Canada, based on demographic trends, is that kind of what we had talked about a bit earlier, that the cities would be these multicultural areas, and that rural Canada would go back to the Indigenous and the natives.
Oh, wow.
Majority. Is that something like, and that's stuck with me because it is a big statement. Is that something in your research, that if you extrapolate your long-term demographic data, that the future of Canada is multicultural cities and the rest Indigenous?
Yeah, I didn't look at that specifically. I did look at the difference between cities and not cities and so forth, and hopefully you'll have a chance to read the paper when it comes out quite soon. I didn't look specifically at the Indigenous side of things, but I will say this: fertility rates among Indigenous people, again, that's a myth people have, right? That they're ongoing and high. Actually, they're cascading downwards, just like it is for other folks who live in Canada. a really good illustration of that is the fertility rate of Nunavut. Nunavut is the one political jurisdiction in Canada that is a majority Indigenous, right? It's the only one. And it's had a much higher fertility rate than the other Canadian provinces and territories, but it's slowly moving to below replacement too. It's like, I think it's now 2.3, I think was the last I looked for Nunavut.
Wow.
Used to be like 3.8 or something like that. So the same kind of demographic transformation that's happened for Canadians more generally is also happening in Indigenous communities in Canada. Also, second point, so is urbanization, right? So an increasing proportion of the Indigenous population also is drawn to the opportunities that are available in Canadian cities. So that's where I would, I agree with that person. Sorry, I didn't catch the person thing. I would agree with that person's analysis that cities are looking different from not cities. But the idea that Indigenous people are so separate from these other trends in Canada, I'm a little skeptical on that front.
Awesome. This was great. We'll probably will have to have you back on when the other paper comes out.
Yeah, I have one final question, which is
Sure.
whether or not you think that type of data, that type of information about long-term demographics, do you think that that's actively being engaged with in policymaking? I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I'm just kind of wondering.
I kind of do, since
Yeah.
I had a almost 3-year secondment to IRCC, and that just ended a year ago.
Yeah.
And so I commissioned that. I worked with my colleagues in IRCC, who, by the way, full respect. Wow, the folks that are working on analytics in IRCC and strategic policy, really capable, really highly analytical, very thoughtful people. I've really enjoyed working with them. And yeah, we worked on that commission. We got it done. I was super pleased. Like the contract I had with IRCC said that whatever I did in the organization was not to be made public, but they allowed me to make this public, which, you know, I'm very grateful for. It's great.
That's great.
But this is the kind of work that is being done behind the scenes.
That is encouraging in some way.
And StatCan, if I can just go back to StatCan, my goodness, their demographers are excellent, and their demographic modeling is absolutely world class. Like really in the top echelon of how well these things are being performed across the world. So yeah, really good people. But remember, there's a difference between what's going on in the
bureaucrats and politics
and the political choices that are being made.
Totally
You're well aware of that distinction. So
yeah, for sure.
You know, in the bureaucracy, fantastic research can be done, but once it gets to the political level, you know, people are saying things like, well, we won't be popular if we say we should raise the retirement age, so let's just forget that. Well, okay, you just
100%.
you dumped a whole bunch of really important stuff that people have found out.
But also, I mean, as we've seen so much over the last little while, like if there isn't the matching infrastructure, you can't attract the people that we need. And that's something that we've talked about pretty endlessly, is that how is all of this public policy, how have the missteps that have occurred over the last couple of years, how are they going to change immigration, Canada's brand to the outside world, and how is that going to change who we're able to attract and retain?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, the future's going to be like Wall-E. We're all just going to have robots solve everything. Awesome.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all your